tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Jade, and it's been wonderful. Again, Paul, thanks to you to have the honour to reflect on our mutual sharing of our commitment to housing and our success and well-being through housing, indicated by the number of years that we have collectively spent. So that was quite thrilling. I have to say that Charles and I probably look pretty tired, and I think the reason we look pretty tired. Have we got any slides up, or is that going to happen later?
Yeah,
I've lost.
Just watch in front of you, Kate.
Look. Aha. Is because actually housing has been a very painful experience. Not just, but it's exemplified in the terrible tragedy that we saw up at Loafers in the last few days, and how that has revealed a whole number of things about the housing system. And I'm going to come back to boarding houses a little bit later, because I think this is part of, I keep on seeing notices saying, boarding houses have always been awful. Yes, they've always been very marginal, but our boarding houses of today are actually very different from the boarding houses of 30 years ago. Sometimes great tragedy existed in those boarding houses, but our potential for tragedy, our potential for the loss of human life is much greater today than it was even 30 years ago, and I'll talk about why. When Paul asked me if I would speak to this, I actually just felt, and this is going to be a bit of a downer, so just prepare yourselves. You'll get all the up stuff later. I'm the one, old war stories here. But I did feel a bit tired about the whole thing. And I thought, well, part of that is COVID, and it's been a really terrible time. Part of it is because we've had terrible natural adverse events. But part of it is because we've just been around an awful long time. And what the last few years, I think, has shown us is that, in fact, we have a housing crisis, we had a housing crisis, and the housing crisis is not that easy to solve. And you can actually put an awful lot of resource into it, but it's still hard to solve. And that's partly because the housing crisis got past the tipping point. That is, no matter what you do, the symptoms of crisis, the human tragedy of crisis, will keep on going for some time. And it will worsen before it gets better. And I'm sorry that that's such a downward message, but that is the case. And one of the things that has taught me, though, is that the reaction to the crisis without a system change simply creates a series of perverse incentives in the system. It creates poor relative returns, coming back to the point that Jade made about evaluation. It also leads to some short-term gains for some and some long-term pain for others. And it often is based on distortion and illusion. And so that pain, I think, has prompted all of us at various times, but I guess for me in particular at the moment, is to think about what is the purpose and the potential of both the housing system, but more particularly the community housing sector, the myriad of actors and places that it relates to within the housing system, the construction industry and the urban system. And the biggest question of all, of course, is a housing system that is adaptable and sustainable and deals well for people. Is it possible at all? So I thought, in thinking about that, I thought I would share with you some of the things that I feel that I've learnt over the last very long time. And I think the first thing, and many of you would have heard me say this before, one of the things that we need to confront is that the housing system is struggling because we had a huge national experiment in the 1990s, which effectively combined a low-care, low-planning configuration of market and welfareism. You didn't have to care too much because you're either in market exchanges or you were going to be dealt with through the Social Security Act. It was a national experiment that changed our housing system into a property market. not even a housing market, but a property market. And it accepted and has accepted many decades now of housing exclusion, despite the expense of it. The accommodation supplement is just like, it's like the magic money tree, isn't it? It just keeps on growing and, money keeps pouring out of it. And there's virtually no impact on it. Some work that Ian Mitchell and I did a few years ago found that actually, although getting that money into people's pocket was important because people were under-resourced, particularly people in the very low income brackets, the reality is, in terms of making a difference in housing stress, is for about $2 billion a year, year in, year out. It really took only about 13,000 households out of housing stress into non-stressed housing situations. That's a hell of a lot of money to be paying out for a very little return. And so what we found is that despite all the rhetoric that we got, what the housing experiment in the 1990s, which saw us get out of investment into owner-occupation, investment into social housing, and got essentially most assistance paid through the accommodation supplement, what we got was actually a system that provides less choice, more housing stress, and less stock alignment between the stock that's built and the households that need to use them. And so what we've also done in that is adopt a whole series of quite distortionary narratives, and I'm going to talk about a couple of them today. The way in which it's the explanation for housing stress is it's either people are unwell and therefore they enter into homelessness, of housing stress of various times, that suppressed incomes mean that people can't get out of housing stress, that we have a home ownership addiction in New Zealand which causes rental undersupply, all those sorts of things that you've heard day in, day out for quite a number of years now, decades even. And we end up confusing concepts like housing continuum, public housing, housing affordability, supported housing. Sometimes I sort of feel if someone says to me, well, what does affordable housing mean, Kay? I just feel like giving them a poke in the eye, quite frankly. I know that's very unprofessional, but I'm close to the end of my tether on this one. I'm pretty on the end of my tether about the undersupply of rental too, but I'll come back to that. And what we have is a long-standing neglect and lack of attention given to the predictable. Predictable outcomes were and have been and often continue to be ignored. The demography of housing is largely ignored. Housing investment and the lack of it is ignored. And of course, the impacts of our natural adverse events arising from climate change, but not just climate change. As you know, New Zealand is a very fragile environment, but we haven't built or provided for housing within it. So I'm going to just have a quick talk about some stuff about incomes, housing stress and inequality. I'm going to take some of those narratives and have a wee look at them, give you some data. Don't worry about it if you can't read it. I'll A, tell you, and B, you can get this presentation. And often it's not the numbers that matter, it's the pattern, so I will explain that. So the first thing that you often hear is it's not a housing problem, it's an income problem. If people had higher incomes, as if we're all prepared to give people higher incomes. That's the subtext to that. You say, oh, okay, if that's right, let's do higher incomes. And, oh, no, we don't want to do that. So it's really not a housing system problem here. We've just got an income system problem here. Well, let me just show you something about Marlborough, which is a place that I live in and I love very dearly. And in the yellow and red and green graph, what you will see on probably your right, I hope, in the green, is how median incomes have increased between 1996 and 2021, and they've increased by 140%. Sounds pretty good. Unfortunately, lower quartile house prices have increased by 458%. And the median market rent has increased by 200%. So you have to get an awful lot of increased income to be able to meet those new housing costs which are evident in the market. So I get very anxious when people talk to me about it's all about income, because it clearly isn't all about income. It's all about the cost of housing and how we get access to it. And what that has meant, that, and the graph on that that you see up in your left-hand corner there, shows you inequality and how that's related to housing costs. And as you'll see on the blue line, it's sort of going up gently. That means inequality is increasing between 1980 and 2018 or so. It's increasing, no doubt about that, but that's before housing costs are taken out. Have a look after housing costs are taken out, and that's the red line, and you'll see the sharp increase in inequality around the 1990s, what a surprise that turned out to be, which means that it's housing costs that are driving inequality, not inequality driving housing costs, it's housing costs themselves are driving inequality. Then the next thing I just wanted to get my head around a little bit and share with you is this notion that we have a rental supply problem. And actually, in a sense, we do, because we have lots of people on the rental market who can't get into rent, let alone affordable rent. But is it a rental supply problem? Probably not. The real supply problem has been in owner-occupied stock. So if you look at the owner-occupied stock between 1986 and 2018, it increased by about 37%. That's less than the total stock increase in New Zealand, which increased by about 53%. But look what happened with the private property investor stock, increased by 191%. So what you have there is not a supply problem of rental, but actually an undersupply, an under-accessing, an exclusion from owner-occupation. So if you're my age, you're almost irrespective, actually, of your income, you are likely to get into owner-occupation because there are a whole lot of things that were done to support that. And as we've got younger and younger, those groups have got less and less. And so what we see is in 1986, about 14% of our stock was owned by, in the private rental market, is now 27%. So it's not a supply problem as such, but it is pressure on the rental market, which largely comes out of the decline in owner-occupation, and that largely comes out of disinvestment by central government, both in public housing, community housing, and in support for owner-occupation through lending. And you can see that in the red bars on that graph, and you can see the huge decline that occurred after about, after about 1991, just dropped away, and it's kept on dropping away. So it is a supply problem, but it's not the supply and the rental that is the problem. We're actually overindulged with rental housing in the private rental market, and we've lost it elsewhere. And you can see that in terms of the changes between the stock ownership between each census. The important piece of this, and I'll come back to this in a second, is that for a number of intercensus periods, we actually lost stock out of public housing. We lost stock out of community housing. And you notice that I do not conflate those two. I know it's fashionable, and from a policy perspective it is done now, but it is not an appropriate conflation. I have now tried to persuade people to talk about IRRS funding as opposed to public housing. Community housing and public housing should, and in most jurisdictions, is different. That's not saying that public housing is unimportant, but it is saying that it's important that community housing is not merely seen as the agent of the state. It has its own place. It has its own kaupapa. And as you can see with the red line at the bottom of here, the stock has been falling in both public housing and community housing over quite a long period of time. Diddled around in the 1985s, but has kept on going down. Certainly is not keeping up with population change. I'm not going to talk about the eyebrow graph because many of you will have seen it, but let me just, and you don't need to know what every line is, but broadly what it says, if you were lucky enough to be born in a certain cohort, you are probably going to end up in owner-occupation. And so to the point that if you were born in 1927, 1931, by the time you were 65 years of age, you were probably in an owner-occupied dwelling. Around 88% of people were in owner-occupied dwellings who were born in that cohort. This is one of the other myths that I just want to think. There's a lot of people that get very concerned and say, well, owner-occupation is really anti-egalitarianism. Actually, what this graph shows is that owner-occupation was a pathway to egalitarianism. And the interesting thing about owner-occupation, in terms of the failure to understand demography, is, of course, is that we rip that out. We rip the heart of that out just at the moment that Māori and Pacific people were getting to the age groups where they needed that investment for their well-being. So in the 1990s and now, we have a demographic structure for the Māori population and for the Pacific populations, which looks very much like the European populations in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, where there was a huge investment placed into owner-occupation, access to lending and so forth. We took that away, and then governments, not this particular government specifically, but governments in general, keep on sort of saying, well, why is it that Māori and Pacific just are doing so badly in housing? Because we gave them no money. That's why. It's a very, very simple equation. If you don't invest, then people cannot resolve their housing need. So why am I saying all this stuff to you? Because you live this all day. There's nothing I'm telling you that you probably don't know. So I'm saying it was partly because I think for the first time in 35, 40 years, system change is being pursued as opposed to fiddling around on the edges. I think because the community housing sector is one of the most critical sectors in the housing system. One, but a critical part of the housing system, in part because it has skin in the game. It cares, it's there for a long period of time. In part because it creates value, both human value and supports the creation of independence as opposed to predating on the value that people have in their human capital. In part because it's diverse in terms of stock, diverse in terms of tenures, and it is diverse in terms of presence across the country. In part because the community sector is the only part of the housing system that embeds friendly landlord, embeds being a friendly partner, and is place and person centred. But it does mean that the chips do have some, as you know, very difficult times. And there are issues for chips about how chips operate in a very complex system which is underfunded and under-resourced. And it's really the chip sector, as a sector, has a choice. You can be an organisational champion, you can be a sector champion, or you can be a system citizen. And that's one of the big questions that I think people need in terms of their own organisations to reflect on. An organisational champion is around an organisation that's most concerned with their market share, market in a broad sense. They're often internally competitive within a sector, They're often finance directed, which, aren't we all? Is often around drawing boundaries and often saying they do important stuff and these people do less important stuff. That's a real issue for a community sector if it gets into that, and there have been times across the trajectory of the community sector where that has happened, and it's always a risk. A sector champion, of course, is saying, we hold the flame here, and we need to go forward with that flame. And that's a very important thing. Sector advocates, you're finding the best fit for government policy or policy at any particular time. You're running towards that ball so that the sector can survive, so that the sector's survival leads to good outcomes and well-being. It's an important role. These are not mutually exclusive, of course. But there's also a system citizenship. There's the notion that our housing system needs balance, that there are many players in the housing system. I was going to get a bit biblical then, and then I thought, no, I'll just go straight to housing system. That won't be too biblical. I'll leave that to Paul. It's important for a community sector, in my view, if it's going to be a system citizen, to look not only at the sector, but the resilience of the system as a whole and the way it contributes and adds value to that system, that it actually recognises the importance of place, people and stock, and it's information-rich and knowledge-based. Broadly, what I think we have is that successful housing systems involve investment from all the players. Housing is not cheap. Everyone needs to make an investment in there. The successful housing systems are about enabling and incentivising. They're tool-rich, so we have lots of choices depending on how circumstances change. They're diverse. I keep banging on about diversity, but balance. And most importantly is that if you've got all of those things, you also need to have an orderly system so people know where they are in it. You're not running around chasing your own tails, trying to work out, if I do this tomorrow, will I get that, or is there another rule to the game? And I think that we can all agree that over the last decades or so, there has been an awful lot of misunderstanding about the rules of the game, particularly where it comes to government investment. And that is, and in the RMA and a variety of other things as well, but particularly in terms of government investment. It's been a deal-based housing system, not a housing system directed towards getting balance, resilience and sustainability. So it tends to push people into being organisational champions. And the last slide that I want to just talk about is about why is this so hard. One of the things is really hard to keep up with things. Coming back to the boarding house situation of loafers. Loafers as a boarding house would be almost unthinkable 30 years ago. Most boarding houses had about maybe up to 20 people living in them. The boarding house owner usually lived in the same space. That wasn't always great for people, but they were there. It was a very different environment to retrofitting an office building and sticking in 90 people into an office building over 3 floors and not having a daytime person there. It's a very different world. And that reflects, if you like, the way that we've moved from housing and home to property and profit. And in a way, what we have here represents disaster capitalism. And part of the reason why we find that so difficult to face up to is because we need to make a big shift. And you need an awful lot of data. And the reason I've talked about the Thomas Kuhn affair is, apart from the fact that I was too young to go to the Thomas Crown affair when it first came out, but because it, had a 16, I think, on it or something like that. So I was a bit young for that. I was very compliant, so I didn't try to sneak in. But the Thomas Kuhn always said is that before we make big changes, we resist and resist and resist despite the evidence. And so you can have lots and lots of evidence saying a system does not work, and big players within that system will keep on saying, and small players as well, will keep on saying it does work. They'll find excuses about why the system works, and they'll often say, we just need to fix this bit or that bit. And so Thomas Kuhn was talking about science and knowledge, but it applies here. It's taking us an awful long time to recognise that market welfare combination has not worked, and that we have a housing crisis because of that. And to leave that, we need to leave that paradigm behind. It also is a barrier for all of us, but I think probably for the community sector in particular. There are costs to upholding your values and principles, particularly where there is a lot of political engagement, and particularly where you're under funded and underinvestment. So the sense of urgency is on one hand, but the sense of risk that if we stand up and advocate on the other becomes quite pronounced, and that's often, I think, why organisations end up being organisational champions, sometimes sector champions, but why they find being a citizen champion so difficult, because it's hard and because you feel threatened. And then the final thing is that we are also, in dealing with a crisis that is over the tipping point, and despite all the hard work you do, I'm not saying stop the hard work, we're all over the tipping point, it's hell, we're going to hell in a handcart. On the contrary, I'm saying you're doing a fine, fine, fine job, but don't expect it to suddenly turn around. And that's even more so when you're confronted with huge demographic change. The problems arising about the failure to recognise the demographic transitions of European, Māori and Pacific populations. That's led to an inequality which is very difficult to deal with because we ignored it. 1990 reforms didn't talk about it. We have huge biophysical challenges, and we have a stock which is often dysfunctional, often doesn't actually perform well, but is in fact in desperate need of promotion, repair, retrofit, so that we can move forward. So I don't want to sound too miserable, because I say these things because you are making a difference, but at times probably doesn't feel as though you are. That's not your fault. That's actually part of this process, and I fear that you're just going to have to work your way through it. Keep the faith, keep doing better, more of what you're doing, and keep putting your hand up around the importance of a sector that is totally committed, has skin in the game for both the stock and the people for whom you are the major service providers, not only housing providers, but also in terms of advocate for the future. So that's
Hey, I think ask you to step aside out there with